Nicole Donovan was 28 years old and worked as an ICU nurse at a regional hospital outside Columbus, Ohio. She lived alone in a small apartment filled mostly with things she hadn't had time to replace since her mother's illness ended the previous fall. Her life had settled into the quiet rhythm common to people who work night shifts, sleep during the day, coffee in silence, conversations that happened in short bursts between exhaustion. Before I continue, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has subscribed and supported this channel. It truly means more than you know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. It's completely free, and it helps the channel grow. Like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. For most of her life, she believed her family operated the way all families did. Her father, Thomas Grayson, made decisions. Her mother, Margaret Donovan, accommodated them. Their white colonial home on Maple Lane reflected that balance. It was orderly, attractive, and carefully maintained, but never loud or spontaneous. Margaret moved through it softly, stepping around the same creaking floorboards every morning before watering the hydrangeas she planted along the walkway years earlier. Nicole grew up believing the quiet was simply her mother's personality. Only later did she understand it had been a strategy for peace. Thomas valued structure and control above everything else, and the household adjusted around him the way furniture adjusts to a fixed wall. That understanding would come slowly, over years, but at the time Nicole thought their routines were simply tradition. Thomas's authority in the house was rarely spoken aloud, yet it shaped daily life. The thermostat remained fixed at temperatures he preferred, the television remote rested beside his leather recliner, and grocery purchases were planned around his tastes. Margaret handled meals, schedules, and finances under his direction. She did not maintain her own bank account and instead asked for weekly household money, which Thomas provided in counted bills. Nicole noticed the arrangement only when she stayed overnight at a friend's home in high school and watched her friend's mother pay for groceries with her own card without explanation or permission. That small difference unsettled her more than any argument might have. Margaret never complained openly. When disagreements arose, she became still and quiet, allowing Thomas to conclude discussions in the way he considered appropriate. Nicole interpreted this as patience rather than caution. The house itself remained warm and welcoming because Margaret invested her effort into its details: the porch swing from an estate sale, the herb garden by the kitchen window, and the hydrangeas that returned each summer. Thomas referred to the property as his responsibility, a point he mentioned casually in conversation, and Nicole accepted that description without question. The first time Nicole sensed a deeper tension came when she was 16. Thomas returned home frustrated from work and directed his irritation toward her, criticizing her grades, her friends, and the length of her shorts. Margaret sat at the kitchen table while it happened, hands folded. For a brief moment, Nicole saw her shoulders relax when the criticism stayed focused on their daughter rather than herself. The reaction was fleeting and followed immediately by guilt that appeared in her eyes when they met Nicole's. Later that night, Margaret came quietly to Nicole's room and apologized for not intervening more forcefully. She explained it in simple terms: sometimes peace required restraint. Nicole accepted the explanation at the time, but the exchange lingered in her memory as she grew older. Years later she would recognize that moment as the first clear sign that her mother had been navigating conflict carefully rather than avoiding it. The realization reshaped how Nicole interpreted the household dynamics she had once taken for granted. 3 years before the 4th of July gathering that would change everything, Margaret received a diagnosis of stage 3 pancreatic cancer. She delivered the news to Nicole in the same calm tone she used for smaller inconveniences, as though she did not want to impose. Nicole drove home immediately and found Thomas in the garage polishing his truck while Margaret rested inside. During the following 14 months of treatment, Nicole accompanied her mother to every appointment, arranging her nursing schedule around chemotherapy sessions and recovery periods. Thomas remained present in the household but largely uninvolved in the logistics of care, focusing instead on maintaining normal routines. His detachment did not appear intentionally cruel so much as consistent with his long-held preference for keeping emotions contained. During this period, Margaret began speaking more frequently with her sister, Janet Caldwell, a certified public accountant she trusted for practical advice. Nicole assumed the conversations concerned medical planning or financial organization. In reality, they marked the beginning of a careful process Margaret initiated to ensure clarity about her assets and wishes. Margaret passed away on a Sunday in October with Nicole beside her. The weeks that followed were consumed by arrangements, paperwork, and quiet adjustments to a life without her presence. 5 months later, Thomas introduced Nicole to Vanessa Reed, a real estate agent he had begun seeing. Vanessa appeared confident and professional, approaching the household changes with a practical mindset. At a family dinner, Thomas presented Nicole with documents he described as routine estate administration, asking her to sign several pages. Exhausted from work and grief, she signed most of them but left a few unfinished when she was called back to the hospital for an emergency shift. Among the unsigned pages was a quitclaim deed transferring property rights. Thomas did not immediately notice the omission. In the months that followed, he spoke to relatives about feeling unsupported, framing Nicole's limited visits as distance rather than necessity. Nicole focused on her work and recovery from loss, unaware that decisions made during that dinner, and the documents she had not signed, would soon become critically important. In early spring, Nicole returned to Maple Lane to collect a box of her mother's belongings she had left in an upstairs closet. The house felt unchanged at first glance, yet subtly different in atmosphere. Vanessa's presence was evident in small details: new fragrances, rearranged surfaces, and personal items placed where Margaret's had once been. As Nicole prepared to leave, she noticed a folder on the coffee table bearing the logo of Vanessa's real estate agency. Inside was a comparative market analysis estimating the value of the Maple Lane property. The document suggested that Thomas was considering selling the home. This was the first indication to Nicole that decisions about the house might already be underway. She left without confrontation, but the discovery prompted her to pay closer attention when Thomas later invited her to dinner and again presented a single document for signature. This time, Nicole read the page carefully. It was a quitclaim deed transferring all property interest to Thomas. When she declined to sign without legal review, Thomas expressed surprise, but she maintained her position and took the document with her. Nicole drove directly to Janet Caldwell's home that evening. Janet had long been Margaret's most trusted confidant, particularly in financial matters. When Nicole placed the quitclaim deed on the kitchen table, Janet read it slowly before explaining its implications. She clarified that the Maple Lane property had been purchased years earlier using funds Margaret received from her parents. The deed, Janet confirmed, was solely in Margaret's name. Nicole learned that her mother had worked with attorney Daniel Foster to prepare a will well before her illness advanced. According to that will, the property had been designated to pass to Nicole. Janet retrieved a sealed envelope Margaret had left in her care, explaining that it was meant for Nicole when she was ready to understand its contents. Janet also mentioned that she had assisted Margaret in organizing her personal finances during the previous year, emphasizing that Margaret wanted clarity and protection for the future. Nicole left with the letter and the quitclaim deed, recognizing that the situation required professional guidance. The next morning, Nicole contacted Daniel Foster's office. Foster confirmed that Margaret's will had been properly filed and executed through probate after her passing. As a result, legal ownership of the Maple Lane property had already transferred to Nicole. Thomas retained the ability to reside in the home temporarily, but he had no authority to sell or encumber it without Nicole's consent. Foster further explained that Margaret had established a revocable trust after an earlier financial concern arose. Months before her death, a bank had alerted Foster to an application Thomas submitted seeking a second mortgage on the property despite not being listed on the deed. The request had been denied. Following that incident, Margaret asked Foster and Janet to formalize her estate plan and fund the trust to ensure stability for Nicole's future. The timeline was clear. Margaret wrote her personal letter earlier, then later took legal steps when she realized additional safeguards were necessary. Nicole understood that Thomas's recent request for her signature was an attempt to obtain ownership through her cooperation. A few weeks later, Thomas invited Nicole to a 4th of July gathering at Maple Lane. The event brought together extended family and neighbors in a familiar setting that appeared unchanged on the surface. Nicole attended after her shift, carrying copies of the recorded deed and the relevant section of Margaret's will. Janet and her son Evan were also present. During the afternoon, Thomas mentioned the property in passing and later encouraged Nicole to finalize what he described as remaining paperwork. Vanessa quietly placed the quitclaim deed and a pen on the table beside Nicole's plate. When Nicole declined to sign, explaining that the property had already transferred legally, the conversation shifted from casual to tense. Janet confirmed the legal status of the estate, and Nicole produced the documentation Foster had provided. The exchange remained controlled but unmistakably decisive. Vanessa, recognizing the legal implications, stepped back from the discussion. Thomas did not escalate the situation further, and the gathering gradually resumed its social tone, though with an undercurrent of awareness among those present. Following the holiday, Daniel Foster sent Thomas a formal notice clarifying Nicole's ownership and outlining the legal framework for his continued occupancy. The letter provided a 60-day period for relocation, consistent with standard procedures. Thomas did not contest the notice. Over the following weeks, he made arrangements to move in with his brother Robert while adjusting his financial commitments. Vanessa, understanding the situation from a professional standpoint, ended their relationship amicably. Nicole used the time to organize the home's transition, balancing her work schedule with practical tasks such as updating insurance and utilities in her name. The trust Margaret had established remained intact, offering financial flexibility for Nicole's student loans and future planning. By late summer, the relocation was complete. The Maple Lane house stood ready for Nicole's return, not as a contested asset but as a clearly defined inheritance shaped by Margaret's foresight and Janet's assistance. Nicole moved back into the Maple Lane house at the end of August. The transition was practical rather than emotional at first. She arrived with a few boxes and a list of updates to complete before returning to her hospital schedule. The living room felt larger without Thomas's recliner, which he had taken with him. Nicole replaced it with a reading chair she found at a local estate sale, choosing something simple that fit naturally into the space. She restored small personal details that had belonged to Margaret, including the framed wedding photograph she discovered packed away in the garage. The house itself had been well maintained, and Thomas had left it clean when he moved out. Nicole interpreted this as a gesture of closure rather than apology. With Janet's guidance, she updated the property records and ensured utilities, insurance, and taxes reflected her ownership. Each task grounded the transition in practical reality rather than sentiment. By the time she resumed her regular shifts at the hospital, the house had begun to feel less like a preserved memory and more like a functioning home. Settling in revealed how much Margaret's routines had shaped the space. Nicole noticed the hydrangeas blooming along the walkway and began watering them each morning before her shifts, continuing a habit she remembered from childhood. Inside, she organized the kitchen and bedrooms with a focus on efficiency rather than nostalgia. Janet visited frequently during the first few weeks, offering help with paperwork and occasionally bringing meals. Their conversations were straightforward and calm, reflecting the same practical approach Margaret had valued. Evan assisted with minor repairs, including replacing 2 loose porch boards that had creaked for years. These small adjustments marked the first visible changes to the property since Margaret's passing. Nicole appreciated the balance between maintaining familiarity and creating new functionality. The trust Margaret established remained untouched except for necessary administrative steps. Nicole viewed it as a long-term safeguard rather than immediate support, preferring to manage daily expenses through her own income. This choice reinforced her sense of independence while honoring the intention behind her mother's planning. Communication within the extended family also began to shift. Robert called Nicole a few weeks after Thomas moved in with him. The conversation was measured and reflective. He acknowledged that he had accepted Thomas's earlier descriptions of the situation without verifying them and apologized for any assumptions he had made about Nicole's absence during Margaret's illness. Nicole responded calmly, explaining that her work schedule and caregiving responsibilities had limited her availability rather than diminished her concern. Robert shared that Thomas was adjusting to his new circumstances while continuing his work at the auto parts store. The discussion avoided blame and instead focused on clarifying misunderstandings that had developed over time. Nicole appreciated the straightforward exchange. It confirmed that relationships could adapt when information became clearer. Janet later remarked that transparency often resolved tensions more effectively than confrontation, a perspective Nicole found consistent with her professional experience in the ICU, where clear communication frequently prevented escalation. By early autumn, Nicole had established a sustainable routine in the Maple Lane house. Her mornings included brief maintenance tasks, while evenings were reserved for rest before night shifts. She reviewed the trust documents with Daniel Foster to ensure long-term planning aligned with her goals, particularly regarding student loans and emergency savings. Foster confirmed that Margaret's structure provided flexibility without imposing immediate obligations. Nicole also considered modest updates to the property, such as repainting the porch and improving outdoor lighting. These decisions were guided by practicality rather than sentiment. The house functioned as both residence and responsibility, requiring ongoing attention but offering stability in return. Janet encouraged Nicole to take her time with any larger changes, emphasizing that ownership allowed for gradual adaptation. Nicole agreed, preferring steady progress over dramatic renovation. The approach mirrored the incremental way she managed complex cases at work, assessing, adjusting, and moving forward with clarity. Winter approached quietly that year, and with it came a sense of settled continuity. Nicole spent more time in the living room reading after shifts, appreciating the absence of tension that had once shaped the household atmosphere. The hydrangeas were trimmed back for the season, and the porch boards held firm underfoot. Occasionally, She thought about the sequence of events that had brought her back to Maple Lane, recognizing how Margaret's earlier decisions had influenced the outcome. The letter Margaret left remained stored with important documents rather than displayed, a personal message rather than a public statement. Nicole viewed it as guidance rather than justification. Her focus remained on maintaining balance between work and home, supported by Janet's advice and the legal clarity Daniel Foster had helped establish. As the year drew to a close, the house no longer felt defined by past conflicts. Instead, it stood as a stable environment shaped by preparation, transparency, and steady adaptation. By the start of the new year, Nicole had fully adjusted to life at Maple Lane. The house functioned smoothly within her daily routine, offering stability rather than emotional weight. She continued her ICU work without interruption and gradually shifted from reacting to past events toward planning for the future. The trust Margaret had established remained intact, providing reassurance without influencing Nicole's immediate decisions. Instead of drawing from it, she prioritized managing her finances independently. This approach reflected the values her mother had emphasized: preparation without dependency. Janet remained a steady presence, occasionally reviewing paperwork or offering practical advice when needed. Their relationship had deepened through shared responsibility rather than shared loss. Nicole also began forming connections within the neighborhood on her own terms, introducing herself not as someone returning to a family home but as its current resident. The distinction felt important. It marked a quiet but meaningful transition from inheritance to ownership. Thomas's situation evolved gradually. Robert mentioned during a later conversation that Thomas had settled into a predictable routine, balancing work with modest living arrangements. There were no dramatic reconciliations or confrontations. Instead, the distance between father and daughter allowed both to adjust without pressure. Nicole remained open to communication but did not initiate it, respecting the space needed for genuine reflection. She understood that meaningful dialogue would require clarity rather than obligation. Janet supported this approach, noting that time often provided perspective more effectively than immediate resolution. Nicole agreed. Her focus remained on maintaining her own stability rather than revisiting past disputes. The absence of conflict felt less like avoidance and more like a deliberate choice to move forward constructively. Spring returned with familiar signs. The hydrangeas along the walkway began to show new growth, and the porch once again became a place Nicole paused before leaving for work. She approached these routines without ceremony, simply integrating them into her schedule. The house required ongoing care, from seasonal maintenance to administrative updates, and Nicole addressed each task systematically. Daniel Foster confirmed that all legal records remained in order, while Janet ensured financial documentation stayed organized. These practical confirmations reinforced the clarity Margaret had intended when she finalized her plans. Nicole appreciated that the process had been guided by foresight rather than conflict. Each small step, from trimming shrubs to reviewing insurance policies, reflected a continuation of that preparation. By early summer, Nicole recognized that Maple Lane no longer represented a point of tension within the family. Instead, it stood as a resolved chapter shaped by careful planning and responsible follow-through. She hosted a modest gathering for Janet and Evan one evening, sharing a meal prepared in the kitchen Margaret had once managed. The atmosphere was relaxed and unremarkable in the best way, free from underlying expectations or obligations. Conversations centered on work, community events, and everyday matters rather than past disputes. Nicole viewed this shift as evidence that clarity had replaced uncertainty. The house served its intended purpose, providing a stable environment that supported her daily life without defining it. As another 4th of July approached, Nicole reflected briefly on the changes that had unfolded over the previous year. The decisions Margaret made, supported by Janet and formalized by Daniel Foster, had ensured a clear and realistic outcome. Nicole now lived and worked without the unresolved questions that once surrounded the property. The hydrangeas bloomed along the walkway as they had for years, maintained not out of obligation but as part of a routine she chose to continue. Maple Lane had become simply her home, legally defined, practically managed, and emotionally balanced. The story that began with uncertainty concluded not with confrontation but with clarity, shaped by preparation and steady action. Thank you for watching until the end. Nicole's story shows that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stand firm and move forward with clarity. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more. I will see you in the next story.